Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to go over something else that I have already done before because I figured it could be interesting to show you some different methods for doing things. Now when I were a wee fella, if you can believe there was ever a time where that was the case, I was pretty interested in historical gaming, but one of the things that put me off was the thought that everything had to be perfect. That there was a right way of painting absolutely everything, and if you weren't using the correct colors, you were doing it wrong. Now, not everybody has full access to all of these Vallejo colors or Citadel colors, whatever the case may be. You may find that in some areas it's just difficult to get your hands on certain manufacturers. So for that reason I thought, well, why not? Why don't we cover a soldier of the British 8th Army? So in this case, this is a soldier of the 28th Maori Battalion, part of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and there's some links down below for you to get a peek at, some of the information there. Fantastic resources out there. But he's painted using almost exclusively Citadel paints. I do step aside for his skin to use some Foundry stuff, but I'll give you some notes on that when we get there. And as an aside, his helmet is probably going to look a little bit nicer when you paint it. I was experimenting, and yeah, don't experiment when you're on camera, guys. It does go wrong sometimes. But whatever the case, you know, this is a really interesting opportunity. This is one of Warlord's new plastic 8th Army figures. They've got a bunch of different heads in there, which are good for so many of the different nations that took part in that campaign. So definitely check them out. But without mucking around anymore, the paints are going to be listed in the description below. Let's get painting. Now to start off with, I've given him a primer spray of Xandri dust, and then I've gone over with just a thin coat of Xandri dust from the pot, with a little water, just to make sure that my base coat is nice and smooth. Now what we're going to start off with is his uniform, and you do not need to be particularly careful with this at all. Just mix a little bit of water into your Ushabti bone, and we're going to go over all of his kit with this. You'll see it's quite bright by comparison. If you wanted to, you can go ahead and dry brush this, say with Tyrant's Skull or something. But it will look a little bit more faded if you go ahead and start from a brighter coat like this. So this will take just a couple of minutes. And once you've finished, you may find you want to let it dry and give it a second coat, because you see it's not really covering perfectly yet. Not to worry though, it's quite simple to finish. Now one thing I did forget to mention is do his helmet in Ushabti bone as well. It's the same color as his uniform at the moment, but we're going to do something to it later which will fix that up. Okay. I've also got here Mournfang Brown, and we're going to do in all of the wooden details. And not just the wood, there is a little bit of his, what do you call it, water bottle or water canteen down the side there, which will be brown as well. Now don't worry too much if you end up getting this on his skin or the bayonet or anything like that. Just thin it out with a little bit of water and fill in those bits there. Now next we'll get on to all of his webbing. Now the colour of British soldiers' webbing, and I mean British and Commonwealth and of course all the rest, it's a subject of its own research. If you are doing a certain period of the war or a certain theatre, they can be brown or green or what have you. Now luckily for the North African campaign, it's actually fairly simple. What we want is this sort of faded out khaki, canvas appearance. And for that, I'm just using Rakarth Flesh. You'll notice when it goes on, it's a fairly similar color to our Ushabti bone, but as it dries, it goes a little bit darker. And I like it for that sort of sun-bleached appearance that we want for our canvas kit. So go around now, and let's just fill in the whole model, not the whole model, all of his equipment with a little bit of Rakarth Flesh. Don't forget too that his gaiters would also have been this color. Now unfortunately in the Citadel range there isn't a perfect analog for the color that his socks would have been. But as it's his socks, I think we can probably get away with using a little Steel Legion drab. And just paint those in. They are not priority as far as perfection goes, I don't think. But it's your call. If you want to find the right colour for his socks. English uniform is a good one from Vallejo. But we are trying to stick to Citadel for this. So let's just bap these in. Now just before we get into painting his skin, I wanted to mention I did say that this was going to be a mostly Citadel kind of tutorial, and if you want to stick to Citadel paints only for this, then Gawthor Brown makes a pretty good base coat for his skin. It's a little too dark, I think, and I don't think you're going to get a perfect finish without mixing a few of these colors. And there are tutorials out there for painting dark skin with Citadel colors. But instead, I'm going to use some Foundry paints. Now, I really like these systems. They are pretty cool. They're reasonably cheap as well, considering what you get in the pot. Now, these get sold either as sets of 3, like I've bought them here, or you can buy them individually if you just want a certain color. But how it works is much the same as we would paint anything. There's a shade color, a sort of main color, and then a highlight. Now, for Maori skin, they're never quite as dark as just straight brown, okay? So I'm going to use here, this is North African Flesh, this set. And I do thoroughly recommend these. I like them a lot. I use a fair few different Foundry triads for my painting. So, like I said, because I did mention this was going to be largely Citadel, I want to be honest and just say, hey look, I'm not going to use it for the skin because I think we can find something better for this. And this is the business. So let's crack open our Foundry shade for North African Flesh and get started on a skin. The same as with any acrylic paint, you're going to want to add just a little bit of water, just a wee bit off the end of your brush. Mix it into what you're going to paint with, and then away you go. Now these do generally require a second coat on your base coat. You'll see it doesn't cover quite perfectly, but this is a really nice skin tone. Alright, so let's go ahead. We'll come back once he's got a couple of these layers on. Now you'll see once that's gone on, it's actually got quite a red tone to it. And to my mind, that works perfectly well. Humans, we've got a lot of red in us. And, you know, if the red comes out, that's when you've got a problem. But that's not looking too bad. Once we've shaded that and we've done the other 2 layers over the top of it, you'll notice it looks much more natural. If you wanted something, I guess, a little more similar to this flesh shade, Doombull Brown might be a good substitute. But you can experiment with that, see what you like the look of. What we'll go on to now is our Abaddon Black, or any old black you happen to fancy, and just fill in, funnily enough, all of the black details. Now, being a line soldier, he will have black boots, the little black bits on his weapon, and his bayonet sheath too, this bit at the back here, this will also be black. Now do pay mind that some of these guys in the new Warlord kit have got their hair visible from the sides of their helmet, so if you do, just black that in. Now I've got here Lead Belcher, and we're just going to paint in a couple of really prominent, very silver details. And the bayonet, oh my goodness, you knew when you'd been stuck with that, I would say. Look at the size of the bloody thing. And as well, on the subject of the bayonet, there is a tiny wee button on the bayonet sheath here that I'm just going to dab with a little bit, there we go, of Lead Belcher. Otherwise, there's not a huge amount to do. If you are painting a Bren gunner, then for this period, I believe it was the Mark 1 Bren. Don't quote me on which version it was, but the barrel should be a silvery color instead of the black of the rest of the material. So, now that we've done that, we'll wait that to dry and we'll give him about 5 minutes and then we'll hit him with some Agrax Earthshade. Yeah. Now when it comes to shading our miniature this time, we don't want to completely drown it in Agrax Earthshade. All we really want is to get those recesses to stand out a little. So just carefully over the whole model, as you normally would, but just make sure you're not leaving huge amounts of it on anything. So if you get any big pooling areas, move it away with your brush while it's still wet. But just take your time now. And as usual, the whole model with Agrax Earthshade. Now we're getting somewhere. Now I did mention we were going to do something with his helmet to make it look a little different to the rest of his gear. And I've got here Lamenter's Yellow, which is one of the glazes. All I'm going to do is just pop a little bit of that over the hard bits of his helmet. And when that dries, it's going to look a little bit more like the that faded out tin yellow that we had going. So Don't worry too much if this isn't perfect. But once that dries, it's going to look a little more natural. And we'll have that deserty yellow tin equipment look to it. Now, if you would like, you can go over the areas of his uniform again with some shabti bone just to tidy them up, but I don't think it's going to be strictly necessary. Instead, I'm going to go straight to Screaming Skull, and we're going to do just a couple of little highlights along the edges of some of the areas of his uniform. There we go, to pick out some of that detail. Ooh, careful, careful. And make it look just a little more faded towards the edges of his kit. So you can do as much or as little of this as you like, as I'm fond of saying. But just take your time and pick out any areas where you want it to look maybe a little more faded, or maybe just a little bit sharper. It is up to you how much of this you like. Now we're getting somewhere with his uniform, but his helmet is a little too yellow, I think. Maybe that wasn't the right choice. So what I've got here, I've got some flayed one flesh, and I'm just going to paint over the whole thing again. This might take a couple of thin coats. Then we'll hit him with just a little Agrax Earthshade, same as the whole model would have got. Then finally, rather than going full yellow, let's use a little bit of Seraphim Sepia instead. And we'll just cover over... Ah, that looks better. Yeah, this is the way. Seraphim Sepia over the helmet as the last stage for it. Then finally, because we have shaded this twice, we can go straight back to our base coat, so flayed one flesh, and we'll just do a couple of little highlights along the edges. Next up we've got Karak Stone, and we're going to use this just to go over some of the canvas areas. This is not going to give you a very bright, sharp difference in colour, so I recommend go over a fair chunk of the canvas just to brighten it up a little bit and introduce some depth. You can leave all of your nice Agrax Earthshade in the recesses, but for the most part I think you want to cover most of the canvas details in Karak Stone. Now, same as before, with just a little bit of water, I've got the mid-tone for the skin from the Foundry sets. And what we'll do now is just go over most of the visible skin with this paint. And when you get to the face, same as usual, you want to leave just very recesses of colour. But go around now, and this is a lot easier when you haven't got a camera in front of you. Fill in all of the skin areas. Then finally grab the light shade and just take a second here, get a little bit of water, and what we're going to do is paint in, all the typical spots. So back of knuckles, his nose, bridge of his brow, that sort of thing. Anywhere that you would normally highlight your skin. And there we have it. With that third highlight applied, he's starting to look the business. If you reckon his skin looks a little too bright for you though, you can hit him with a bit of Agrax Earthshade just to darken it down again. But I think mixing up the skin tone in a unit can help add a little bit of realism to what you've got going. As it is, I'm thinking that's pretty good. What we'll do now is just bash a base on him. And then with his base finished, our soldier is complete. Now I've gone ahead, I have given him one last Agrax Earthshade over his skin, and I think you see that takes away some of the redness to it. And I quite like how that turned out. Now I thoroughly recommend check out the links down below on information on the Maori Battalion, the actions of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force during World War II. It is a fascinating chapter of the war. Historically speaking, not a lot of people, take a peek. So I reckon go check it out. As ever, if anything was useful to you there, guys, feel free, drop a comment in the old box below, just say hi. As always, you can get in touch either on my Facebook or Twitter, and I do point out I'm always a little bit more active over there on Twitter. So, thank you very much for your time. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.